Hello, everyone, and welcome to the National Shattering Silence Coalition's YouTube channel. My name is Eric Diaz, and now, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest for today, and Brian Stettin. Good to have you.
Eric, great to be with you. Thanks so much for having me on, and it's terrific to connect with you, having appreciated the advocacy that you do for so long. It's just so much more powerful for folks to get the message from someone who's actually been through the ringer of the public mental health system, as you have, than it can ever be from folks like me, just in terms of helping people understand how the reforms that we're all fighting for are about helping people and giving people an opportunity to take back control of their lives. So I'm a big fan of yours and really glad to have a chance to talk to you today.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate that. And one thing that I feel strongly about is my medication gave me my freedom. It didn't take anything away. When I was in psychosis, I didn't have control over my thoughts and actions. And it was
Yeah,
very much when I got on my medication, I had this like horror, like what was I saying? Like luckily I was never involved in law enforcement, but my heart goes out for people that you see in New York, like or on the streets, just in full-blown psychosis. So
for
thank
sure.
you for all that you and the mayor are doing.
Thanks. Appreciate
And
that.
also, I first became aware of the Treatment Advocacy Center when you came to speak to NAMI Cobb. I believe it was sometime in the 2000s. And I had never heard of AOT or Kendra's Law before you came to speak with us. And explain how you got mixed up working with the Treatment Advocacy Center and just your path to work to trying to help people like me and our families.
Sure thing. And I should probably start by making clear I'm no longer at the Treatment Advocacy Center. I was their policy director from 2009 to 2022, but I'm now a senior advisor on severe mental illness to Mayor Eric Adams in New York City, which is a return for me to my hometown. But my involvement with TAC really goes back to its very beginnings as an organization. And I didn't join the staff of TAC until about 10 years after that. But it was a tragedy in New York City on January 3rd, 1999, that kind of brought me into TAC's orbit. And that was an incident that occurred on a subway platform in Manhattan, where a young woman named Kendra Webdale was pushed into the path of an oncoming train by a man named Andrew Goldstein, who was a person with schizophrenia who had really been in the revolving door of the New York City mental health system for quite some time. And that happened to be the evening before my first day on a new job as an assistant attorney general in New York State. I was part of the attorney general's team that was working in the New York City office. And it was a brand new attorney general who'd been elected, Eliot Spitzer, who was my boss, who was bringing in this new administration at the very beginning of the year. So that Monday, January 4th, I was part of this group that was coming in to office with the AG. And this was the cover of the tabloids that day that we were all kind of reading in horror on our way into work, what had happened the evening before where this young woman lost her life. And so before I even had a place to sit that day, I was asked by the Attorney General, who knew I had had some little bit of involvement in something sort of related to the issue at hand and some previous work I'd done. He had asked me to look into what he might propose as Attorney General as a legislative solution to the fact that there were people, obviously like the person who pushed Kendra Webdale, who were untreated with severe mental illness and just kind of unmonitored and uncared for in the streets of New York City, and what might be done about that. And I didn't know a whole lot about the public mental health system at the time, but as I said, I did have some involvement in kind of a quality of life concern on the Upper West Side. In the previous job I had been in, I had been working on urban quality of life issues and had connected with an advocate by the name of DJ Jaffe. And so he was the person that I knew who was the most knowledgeable about the public mental health system. And so kind of having to scramble and give myself a crash course on this issue, I reached out to him, and he was one of the founders of the Treatment Advocacy Center. It had just been a couple of months before that that TAC had gotten off the ground. And so he put me in touch with the brand new staff over there. And in collaboration with them over the next few weeks and months, we developed a proposal for assisted outpatient treatment in New York State that came to be known as Kendra's Law. And worked very closely with them, and it was just kind of a remarkable journey we went on together. And I think kind of shared a lot of pride in how much of a difference Kendricks ended up making in the mental health system in New York State over the years that followed. And ultimately, it led me to come to work for them, as I say, about 10 years after that.
All right. And Mr. Goldstein, you say the revolving door. Do you
Yeah.
remember about how many times he had been in and out of jails and hospitals before this tragic incident?
A lot, a lot. It's, upwards of 25 or 30 times. It was just a really, really sad story to read when you looked at the litany of interactions he had with the public mental health system. And, the pattern was really, kind of tragic and obvious. Again and again, he would be brought to a hospital at a point in which he was kind of acting out in a way that made him appear to meet the legal standard for civil commitment, right? But he would be subdued with medication. He would start to stabilize with treatment, and the hospitals at that point would feel they had no grounds to hold him any longer. And in New York, in those days, there was no legal mechanism to have somebody engage in treatment on an outpatient basis who doesn't understand their own need for it and isn't going to do it voluntarily. So there were basically two statuses a person could have. Either you were currently dangerous to yourself or others, and so you were hospitalized, or you weren't meeting that standard at a particular moment in time, and so you were completely on your own. And so again and again, he was released from hospitals with prescriptions and connections to outpatient providers, and strongly encouraged to stay adherent to his treatment. But he had a very hard time making that happen without the support he needed. And so he would again and again kind of inevitably cycle through the system. He would go through this really vicious cycle where he would decompensate and become a danger to himself or others. And there were other violent incidents in his past, nothing, of course, on the level of what happened with Kendra Webdale that had him in the kind of permanent clutches of the criminal justice system. But there were many people who had worked with him over the years who weren't shocked that it had come to that.
And was there like a caseworker assigned to try to get him monitored, to get him into services? Or was it just every time he came in, it was the first they had seen him?
Yeah, so he was connected with outpatient providers repeatedly. And he would, be given an appointment to come in and see his provider. He would be given a prescription for medication, but was ultimately kind of expected to take personal initiative to follow through with that. And so he would kind of fall off the map again and again. With some of the mechanisms we have in place now, even short of involuntary outpatient treatment through the law that we created then, I think, would have created more opportunities than even existed at that time to really stay engaged with a person once they left the hospital. So, it's fair to say he did not really have much of a chance. And look, there were moments where he would decompensate to the point where he would come to the hospital himself and ask to be admitted. So, it's not that there was this complete lack of insight on his part where he, on some permanent basis, was never cognizant of his need for psychiatric treatment, but hanging on to that understanding, especially when things were starting to feel like they were going a little bit better for him, was really a challenge. And it was a very avoidable tragedy. And I think with having Kendra's law in place in the 20 years since, 25 years, we have, I think, managed to avoid many such similar situations.
All right. And I know when I refused medication initially, and I'm very grateful that they were able to, there's a symptom called anosognosia.
Yeah.
Where when I was in the hospital, I was like, why am I here? Like I had the same symptoms as the people there, but I couldn't understand why I was there. And one thing that helped me take medication is I didn't have to acknowledge that I had schizoaffective disorder to take my medication. And Emory University had me in a clinical trials program, but that was also the only time I leave my house, and they paid me for leaving there. So once you get people in like early, does the mayor have a plan for early psychosis so that maybe there'll be a chance where Kendra's law it doesn't let Kendra's law is still necessary, but is there anything for early psychosis so that maybe Kendra's law won't be necessary?
Yeah, thanks. I'm really glad that you brought up anosognosia because it's such an important concept for people to understand exactly what it is about severe mental illness that it's just fundamentally different than other types of illness that makes it so hard for so many people to stay adherent to their treatment. In a way we just don't see typically with other types of illness, and it's that lack of insight, right? Anosognosia is a neurological syndrome that when someone is afflicted with it, makes it really impossible for them to recognize their illness and their need for treatment, no matter how painfully obvious it is to everyone around them. And this is, so much far beyond denial, as it's often kind of casually referred to. When you're in denial, you actually do know what's going on. You just may not be quite ready to admit it to yourself, but the truth is sort of in there. A person with anosognosia is certain to their core, as I think you've experienced, that the idea that they have a mental illness is absurd, and it's perfectly predictable and understandable why folks don't want to engage in treatment. So to your question as to whether we can get to folks sooner, that's really a challenge, I would say, for our legal systems to kind of impose any kind of an involuntary mechanism on people to receive treatment before they've kind of demonstrated a difficulty engaging with treatment on a voluntary basis. As you know, Kendra's law doesn't really kick in. It's not something a person is eligible for until they've reached the point where they've been through the system a couple of times. You have to have a demonstrated history of not engaging with treatment on a voluntary basis, leading to really bad outcomes for you to qualify for AOT. And, I think that one of the kind of major things we could do that would really be a game changer, and it's actually an element of a piece of legislation that we have currently pending here in New York, is to broaden the admission criteria, right? What allows us to bring somebody into a hospital when they are in psychiatric crisis and not adherent to their, sometimes not even on medication yet in the first place, because it's a first psychotic break. But to recognize that the illness itself, if we allow it to continue to progress, that is, if we allow someone to continue to decompensate, we do kind of reach a point where that we're having a person experience harm to their brain, right? There is damage that takes place to a person's psychiatric well-being when we allow that psychosis to deepen. And we have lots of studies that tell us that the duration of untreated psychosis is a form of harm that is not entirely reparable, right? Because a person's prospects for recovery actually lower when we have them longer disengaged from treatment. So there are many states that in their criteria for what it takes to hospitalize somebody and retain somebody in the hospital recognize that potential for harm to the person's brain as a form of danger to them, such that we don't really need to have a track record of them having suffered terrible consequences before in terms of physical harm or homelessness or violence or acting out against anybody else. We can recognize that harm to the brain that's going to happen if the person doesn't get treatment as a reason to give them treatment. And so I think if we had that in New York, there's a whole lot more we could do about folks in the circumstance you're talking about, get people into treatment earlier and help them avoid being caught in that revolving door in the first place.
Yes, I attribute a lot of my ability to return to work and go to college to the fact that I believe schizophrenia related disorders are misclassified as psychiatric disorders. I believe they're neurological conditions. And any disease like Alzheimer's or anything, the longer you go without treatment, the quicker it progresses.
Right.
And that's something that, yes, I'm very grateful that I was able to be medicated sooner. And also, who are the main opponents and supporters of Kendra's law?
Well, you mean back when we proposed it and the controversy that kind of ensued and
Yeah,
that we dealt with? And I mean, it's died down a lot since then, right? Because we have 25 years of experience where a lot of the kind of predicted parade of horribles did not actually materialize. But back in 1999, I was naive enough to think that we would be kind of universally applauded by the mental health advocacy community, because this to me was so obviously, something that we were proposing to rescue people from a terrible plight and tragic fate. So I was really taken aback by the fact that there were groups that purport to speak for people with mental illness who are unhappy about this proposal and viewed it as a violation of of civil rights. And we can talk more about that. But, I would say that the opposition that we faced kind of broke into two camps, right? There were some really kind of hardcore anti-psychiatry groups who do not recognize the existence of mental illness. They kind of view it as a social construct, don't really believe it's medical disease, and think that it's all kind of a fraud that's been perpetrated by the psychiatry industry, as they would say, and so they kind of view non-compliance with treatment as an act of resistance. And so that kind of opposition, I mean, we're just kind of talking to people who are on a different planet from us in terms of our belief systems, and I think it's really kind of hard to break through that. But at the same time, there were opponents, I think, who do recognize the value of psychiatry, do believe in it, but simply really feel strongly that it's something that can only happen on a voluntary basis, that self-direction is the key to recovery, and just kind of hold fast to that in an extreme. And look, I have some sympathy for that point, a lot of sympathy for that point of view generally. But I just kind of have a problem with it when it's taken to the extreme that we're just going to kind of write people off who cannot self-direct.
What happens, because
Yeah,
protecting someone's rights is different than abandoning them
right,
on the
right.
streets.
Yeah,
And one thing, when I was taking medication, the first medication I was on, I was able to stay out of the hospital, but I wasn't able to do a whole lot. So if I didn't have my mother basically being a 24-hour caregiver, I would have gone back to the hospital very quickly. And a lot of people, that the longer they go without medication, the more they deteriorate,
yeah.
and their capacity to take care of themselves deteriorates. And what happens when someone whose brain has been damaged from, say, 10 years without treatment gets stable? They get the help, they get forced to the treatment, they get the help they need when they're just abandoned on the subway, they get to go to the hospital. Is there a plan in place to make sure that they don't wind up right back on the subway in psychosis?
Yeah, absolutely. So the plan that I've been engaged in developing and implementing here in New York City is about a whole lot more than simply bringing people to a hospital when we observe them in psychiatric crisis. That's certainly where the process starts. But people who do that work have experienced a lot of demoralization over the years, and reason to wonder whether their efforts were accomplishing anything, because there is this kind of phenomenon that we've had of treated and streeted, where people are brought to the hospital, and whatever reason that outreach clinician thought they
Mhm.
needed to be evaluated, they didn't see eye to eye with this doctor evaluating them in an emergency room, and that person was not admitted to the hospital, and maybe they were brought into the hospital and admitted as a patient, but within a day or two their symptoms started to subside with the treatment they received, and they were just kind of
Yeah, they're
evaluated on how they appeared at that following moment, and released well before they were actually ready to stay engaged with treatment on an ongoing basis, and not connected to all the supports they needed. So we're really kind of taking a holistic approach to solving this problem, in which we have our hospital system, where we have the advantage in New York City of having a hospital system that is part of our city government, right? It's the Health and Hospitals Corporation, which operates a network of hospitals across the city. They are key partners in this strategy that we're developing, because we're really trying to make sure not just that we are bringing people into the hospital when they are in psychiatric crisis and need evaluation, but that better understanding of those criteria for what should qualify a person for treatment are also understood in the same way by the folks making decisions about whether to admit and retain people at hospitals. And we're also working with our partners in the State Office of Mental Health to make sure that we have extended care beds available for people who need more than a couple of days, or even more than a couple of weeks of inpatient treatment. When someone has experienced the ravages of homelessness, it typically takes a few months to get them on a track to where we can get them back into the community with a fighting chance to
yeah.
stay safe and stable. And that's a very big part of the thinking and the approach that I think we've put together. And we've gotten some great partnership from the state, in that they've created a unit at Manhattan Psych Center, which is a state hospital here in New York City, called the Transition to Housing Unit, where they're providing people with up to 120 days of inpatient care. Specifically, these are folks who are coming into the system from having been homeless. We also have a couple of extended care units within H&H. And, one of the nice things about hanging on to a person long enough to stabilize them properly and make sure we're getting the meds right and help them learn some habits of self-care that may have kind of been lost over the time they've been homeless. Another really big piece of that is that it gives us an opportunity to transition them directly to supportive housing, which is the name of the game for us. That's what we're trying to do for every single person that we're serving here. And so, it's frustrating when you have to transfer someone initially to a shelter because there is no housing bed available for them yet. It takes more than a couple of weeks, right, to make that housing proper housing situation appear. And so by kind of slowing the process down, we have been able, with some folks we're working with initially, to transition them directly to permanent supportive housing. And it makes all the difference in terms of having that placement stick. So yeah, to answer your question, the hospital care part is a huge piece of this.
Yeah, because if you discharge someone without an appropriate discharge plan, you're guaranteeing that they're going to be back or wind up in a tragedy. And I saw the PBS documentary Right to Fail.
Yeah.
And from what I saw from that documentary, they didn't have the right to sink or swim on their own. They were pretty much set up to fail when they left the adult homes in that. And yeah, I mean, letting someone take out a little bit more stress that might send them back to the hospital is one thing, but just setting them up for failure was just awful from what I saw in that documentary. And what angered me about that documentary is a lot of the people that were responsible for that, their discharges they seem to still be looked to by a lot of people in the media as advocates for people in that are very vulnerable. And what do you think? Do you have any opinions on that?
Yeah, one of the things that's really frustrating to me about the debate that we're still having after all these years that I've been doing this kind of advocacy is really how kind of dumbed down it is, and in that we're kind of pitted in these separate camps on the extremes, right? It's this medical model versus recovery model. Do we have self-direction at all costs, to an extreme degree, or do we impose everything on people and just kind of tell them what's going to happen with their lives and leave nothing up to them?
I run into that a lot because I'll say if someone has azoosinosia, he needs medication, but other than that, they can do what they want and have autonomy. I'm like, oh, so they can't choose whether or not to take meds, but they have autonomy. I'm like, yeah, they just giving them guardrails where they won't hurt themselves or others. But other than that, you're free. No one's going to micromanage everything you do.
Yeah, exactly right. And that's as it should be, right? I mean, what we're trying to do with each person that we're serving is to maximize self-direction, right? To give that person as much room to make decisions and to be a partner in determining what their treatment is going to consist of as we possibly can, while also recognizing there are moments where a person cannot self-direct. I mean, it's a really cruel aspect of the illness. And so we have to be willing to step in to help somebody when they're not going to be able to do it on their own.
And as you mentioned, there is a high bar before you do step in. It's not just a little bit eccentric.
Exactly. It's not a first resort ever. It's always a last resort. And, even when we are using involuntary mechanisms, we're always trying to bring as much self-direction into it as possible. I mean, AOT is a great example of that, right? Where a person is under a court order to engage in outpatient treatment under typical AOT laws you might see around the country. But that's not to say that what that treatment plan consists of that the court approves should ever be developed without the person having a seat at the table and participating fully in figuring out what exactly that treatment ought to consist of, right? And talking to the person developing that plan who's going to present it to the court about what has worked for them in the past, what hasn't, what meds they like, what meds they don't. The only thing that should be non-negotiable in that situation is whether the person will participate in treatment at all. Because you have a court that's determined that treatment is necessary for them to stay safe and stable in the community.
The judge,
but it's not an on-off switch. It's one or the other. It's a mix.
And the judge determines based on medical criteria and other criteria that treatment's necessary, but the judge doesn't come up with the plan. the
That's right.
patient
That's right.
and
That's right.
the team comes up with it.
You're right. And exactly. It's the clinician in partnership and collaboration with the person. In
And
many states and many of the laws I've been involved in drafting, we actually bake that right in,
and
where the person must be involved in the development of their treatment plan.
and also the doctor can't just determine someone needs AOT. The doctor has and the staff have to submit something to a judge. So even though the
That's
judge
that's right.
signs off on it, it's not there's multiple people involved. It's not that some doctor has maybe a bias that is just going to force someone into it. They have to go before a judge and back it up.
That's right. Typically within AOT law, there are sort of two phases to the court order, the hearing process that leads to the court order. The first question is, does this person meet the criteria under that state's law for AOT? Do they have the requisite history suggesting that they strongly need this court order in their life? Once you have determined that, then you get to the second phase, which is what should that treatment consist of? And typically the state petitioner is required to present to the court a treatment plan and defend each aspect of it, explain it in court, and the patient would, through their attorney, would have an opportunity to question and knock out any particular element of that treatment plan that, you know, they don't believe is in their interest or is absolutely necessary. And a court has to actually find that the treatment plan consists of the least restrictive, appropriate level of treatment for each particular element of it. So yeah, it's a very exacting process, and due process is a critical part of it.
All right. And families are often vilified when we try to interject ourselves because I also have a family member with a severe mental illness, and I saw firsthand for 10 years when he was refusing medication. And a lot of times people get mad like we're intruding into their decisions, like they choose to live on the
Yeah.
streets. Or thank God my family member was never homeless, but people get mad. But the thing is, families are the ones that will call out gaps and call out services that are not being provided.
Yep.
So do you have plans to make sure the families are involved when they would be helpful?
Sure. Yeah. So, I would say it's kind of the part of the basic standard of care with each person that comes into our system. Um, Certainly when someone comes into an H&H hospital, or if they're assigned to an ACT team or one of our other street-based treatment teams, they're going to try and determine what family members might be in the picture and might be able to help support that person. And so, it's complicated sometimes by a person not actually wanting their family member engaged.
Hmm?
That's a hump we're not sometimes always entirely able to get over, even if we think it might be in that person's interest. But more often than not, people do want their family members in their lives and want them to, have a role in their recovery. And so the discharge planning that happens in hospitals and the work that our outreach teams do, I think typically does involve the families and communication with the families. We're not always able to provide all the information we might like to that family member, but certainly the receipt of information and the involving in the family member in the person's recovery, I think is a key part of standard of care.
All right. And how many people have gotten care from the mayor's new plan?
So, it's really hard to quantify that, Eric, because I think it's important for people to understand that this policy did not create the practice of involuntary removal of folks to the hospital or involuntary admission of folks to a hospital. It's something that's been going on for decades. It's just kind of a routine function of a public mental health system. And in a city like New York, it's happening to a fair number of people all the time. And
So it clarified what the existing law was.
it clarified the criteria, right? So there was a swath of folks who we feel strongly have qualified for this kind of help, who were being missed because of a pervasive misunderstanding of the law. What I mean by that is that, the law kind of hinges on a finding that a person is a danger to themselves or others. To see someone in the community who you think needs to come to a hospital to be seen by a doctor, you have to have a reason to think that the person appears mentally ill and appears to be a danger to themselves or others. And then that determination has to be made more definitively in a hospital to actually diagnose them with that mental illness and say that that mental illness is leading them to be a danger to self or others. But that danger to self part is often construed too narrowly, more narrowly than the law really actually allows. The danger to others, I think, is fairly straightforward, but danger to self is sometimes understood to simply mean or only mean that the person is suicidal, or they are acting out in some dramatic way that's putting them at risk of death, such as, jumping into traffic, or they have some kind of imminent medical need that they're not getting attention for, and if it's not dealt with right now, they could die. All that has been understood as forms of a person being a danger to themselves, as well it should be. But there's a whole nother category of danger to self that's often missed when we're thinking only in those terms, right? And that is folks whose risk of serious harm may not be imminent, but it's still entirely predictable, right? It's people who are not meeting their basic human needs: food, clothing, shelter, medical care.
And also sleeping on the subway just doesn't seem safe for the person, there. Like it just seems like not aware of your surroundings. It just seems very dangerous for someone to be out there.
For sure. And look, and there's a lot of people in that circumstance who are not severely mentally ill, and there are other reasons why a person might find themselves in that circumstance and taking really bad care of themselves, and that they would not qualify for this kind of help because having that diagnosis or appearance of mental illness is a big part of this.
So someone who's living on the subway but is just having bet down on their luck will be able to access services without the medication and everything, like all the services available for.
Right. Or someone whose primary issue is substance abuse, right? Obviously, there's a lot of dual diagnosis, but there's also a lot of folks who have addictions who are not severely mentally ill at the same time. And that's the primary explanation for why they're on the street and living in really kind of, awful conditions. But when we have reason to think that it's mental illness that's driven a person out there, we actually do have grounds to help. And our law in New York doesn't say that as explicitly as many other states' laws do, something we're hoping to change through this legislative package that we've put together. But the courts have consistently interpreted our more vague law to include that. So we have case law, which is another way that law gets made, right? It's not just the explicit words of the statute. It's also how courts have interpreted the words of the statute. And we have that in New York. But that message has not always been fully understood by the various professions who we rely on to interpret this standard. And so, the main aspect of the culture shift that we're trying to bring about in New York City is about having folks understand that a person who is failing to meet their basic needs as a result of severe mental illness is somebody we can help. And we don't have to walk away and wash our hands of them and say, well, what a terrible tragedy. It's just not anything we can do about it. Because in fact, we can do something and we have the legal authority to do it.
I'll hear people say we can't take away their rights and then talk about what a tragedy it is they wound up like that.
Yeah.
Well, there are ways that it's my understanding no one is in Kendra's law permanently, or a few people.
Right. Well, Kendra's law is a different animal, right? So Kendra's law is not about a person currently being a danger to themselves or others, right? It's about a person having a history of being a danger to themselves or others, such that we're afraid it's going to happen to them again. It's actually ordinarily imposed when a person's coming out of the hospital at a moment when they are stable. So it's not looking at their current condition so much as kind of their history of being in the revolving door. But you're right that even that is not something we impose on a permanent basis. It's typically an order of 6 months or 1 year. And at the end of that, we can renew it. There are people who need to have that order renewed. It's just a question of, at that point, have they developed habits of treatment engagement such that they no longer need the court order?
Based on their current criteria of what they
Yeah. Exactly. And most people do graduate from AOT programs.
And also the people that are getting help on the subway, they're not just being institutionalized forever. They're being stabilized and then going to the least restrictive setting. So people act like they're just being sent away somewhere.
Yeah.
And that's not true.
It's such an important point, and I really appreciate you making it. Hospitalization for us is not the end in itself. It's a means to an end. The end is to get somebody in, as you say, the least restrictive, appropriate setting for them. And for the vast majority of people, that is going to mean a return to the community in permanent supportive housing.
Yes.
But you got to get the person stabilized. You got to get them on the right meds, and you've got to get the supports in place to give them an opportunity to stay engaged in treatment once they come back to the community, for them to have a fighting chance for that to
For,
stick.
for
And that's why
every,
we're bringing people to the hospital, to start that process.
the term institutionalization is a loaded term. When someone is hospitalized, it's like any other illness. They get you stabilized and better, and then they're transferred to a lower level of care.
Yep.
And only if the least restrictive setting um, that possible is a hospital, and that criteria is met, would they stay in the hospital. But sometimes I feel like people act like the hospital is so bad, no matter what happens to them when they leave, we got to get them out.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that you've framed it accurately, and I think we're in agreement that, in the rare case where you have someone who really needs institutional care on a long-term basis, where the only other alternative is that they're going to wind up on the street and rot to death.
Yeah,
Yeah, to me, that's not a hard choice.
that's not a hard.
I'll
And
take the hospital every time. But again, that's not, most of the people that we're working with are
the
not going to come down to that kind of
and
terrible choice.
and like I say, recovery looks different for everyone. There's different. Some people recover, go back to work full time. Some people, their recovery is just maybe living in a congregate setting and
Yep.
just maybe doing volunteer work, but being a part of society. And and then I have one more question. With the migrants, the migrant crisis in New York City, is
Yeah.
that going to have an impact on getting care for people, like say that would be eligible for the plan on the subway, or is that going to like say we want to show love and compassion for people coming to of course to America, but will that affect any services for people under the that the mayor's plan is trying to help, or on Kendra's law?
Well, look, I'll tell you what, under this mayor, we're not going to turn our back on anybody. We're going to do our best with the resources we have available to make sure that each person that we encounter in psychiatric crisis gets the help and support that they need. And we're going to do the best we can with the resources that we have available to us. That said, the more resources we can put into the system, and we have lots of kind of grand, ambitious plans to build a full, robust continuum of care. It's not going to happen overnight, because we have a system that's been neglected for decades, and we're not going to, reverse that like that. But we have very high hopes that we can build a system of care that allows us to really do right in the fullest way by all the folks that we're encountering in this situation. There's no question that our ability to make that happen is going to be impacted by the migrant crisis if we don't get some help from the federal government, some relief with that. No different than any other kind of grand, ambitious plan that we have as an administration, all the things we're hoping to do. We're talking about a $12 billion hole over 4 years that's been blown in our budget. If this situation remains as it is, where we're just not getting the federal support to deal with what's been dropped in our lap. And so, yeah, I mean, that's going to have an impact on everything that we're hoping to do as a city. And it's going to, potentially lead to some scaling back of some really grand, exciting plans that we have. So, we'll never reach the point where we're not going to do the best we can by every single person that we find in need of help. But it's certainly reasonable to expect that we'll be able to do a whole lot more to build that great system of care that folks deserve, if we get some relief from that kind of unexpected crisis that's been dropped in our lap.
All right. And do you have anything you'd like to add before we close out?
Well, I think we've covered a lot. I think one thing I'll mention is that we do have some legislation that is going to be a major priority for our administration, that we're kind of hoping our partners in Albany will help get enacted in the year to come, that will plug a lot of holes and gaps in the law that we rely on to help this particular population. It's not a grand plan to fix the entire mental health system, but this particular legislative package is focused simply on some areas that need shoring up in the laws that address our ability to help people in psychiatric crisis who cannot access care on a voluntary basis because of that lack of insight we've been talking about. And I hope that folks who may be hearing this, who are in New York, who feel strongly that we need to do better by this population, who believe that amazing transformations, remarkable recoveries are possible if we can just get folks on a treatment track. Will kind of get in touch with me and our office and work with us and advocate, help our lawmakers understand how great the need is to make some of these reforms.
All right. Well, Brian, thank you, and thank you, Mayor Adams, for all that you're doing. And
Thank you so much, Eric.
thank you very much for coming on.
Absolutely. Been a great pleasure.